always found related together Tantra and Kundalini in this. When you're talking of Tantra, it's for the purpose of raising the Kundalini, is that right?
Well,
and where does it start to come in? And does it? I'm just trying to get a word in.
Yeah, no, please.
And no, it's fantastic you're talking. But I'll say all my questions, then I won't disrupt you. And then, because I've got you for an hour, and then where does it start to come in? People suggest, I think maybe you suggest that the Tantra stuff creeps in from Buddhism. That it's an interpolation on Vedic thinking from Buddhism. Is that right? Or is there a homegrown idea?
In terms of Hatha Yoga and what became Hatha Yoga, the earliest evidence that we have for the techniques is a Buddhist milieu. It's a Vajrayana Buddhist tantric milieu, and there's also references to Hatha Yoga, even though they're not necessarily explained or described in any detail in Vajrayana Buddhist texts that date from about the late 9th century through to the 11th century. So it seems that the Buddhists were using something called Hatha Yoga, usually as a practice of last resort when their normal tantric sadhana methods had failed. If they were doing a mantra practice or a visualization practice, which was supposed to bring about the goals of their tradition, usually liberation in some form. If that didn't work, then in a couple of instances we get this idea that then they can practice Hatha Yoga, and it might work. It might sort of work where nothing else had worked. But Kundalini is very much a Shaiva phenomenon. It's coming from earlier Shaiva traditions, and the earliest texts that we have that actually teach a yoga called Hatha Yoga that leads to Raja Yoga are Shaiva texts. It's the Amaraugha, the Yoga Bija, the Yoga Taravali, and so forth. They're Shaiva texts that are using these techniques of bandhas, mudras, and kumbhakas to achieve Raja Yoga. And Kundalini is always, in those instances, these early Shaiva traditions, seems to be part of it. And the idea is that she's asleep at the base of the central channel, and her mouth is covering the opening to the central channel, and it's through the practice of Hatha that the yogi can wake her up, rouse her from her sleep, make her straight like a stick, and then start to move her up through the central channel with prana, where the central channel is cleared. And it's when she reaches the head that samadhi, Raja Yoga, usually ensues, and that takes the practitioner, from Hatha through to Raja Yoga, and it's by the practice of Raja Yoga that liberation is achieved. So the texts are very good at giving us the structure of the practice. They may not always give us the details. If you have specific questions about Kundalini, like what happens when she reaches the head, does she unite with Shiva, or does she dissolve into the void, or what happens? It may not necessarily answer such detailed questions, but they give us the structure, and it seems to be through that mechanism that the yogi goes from Hatha to Raja, and Raja is the goal of Hatha, and that's why we get the verse in the Haṭhapradīpikā and the Shiva Samhita that, without Raja Yoga there is no Hatha Yoga, and without Hatha Yoga, Raja Yoga cannot be achieved, because they sort of, by that stage, had reached a sort of a relationship of interdependence. One sort of needed the other, and that wasn't always the case. For instance, in the Amaraugha, it seems that the 4 types of yoga are based on the type of student. So if you were a very capable student, you just go straight to Raja Yoga and bypass Hatha. If you're a bit of a dull student, then you'd be given mantra yoga. That's pretty much what the one portion of the text says. In the Yoga Bija, that relationship is redefined so that everyone starts with mantra, and then they move to Hatha, and then Hatha results in Laya, and then Laya Yoga results in Raja Yoga. It's sort of like a progression. And then in the Haṭhapradīpikā, it becomes a sort of a two-system relationship where there's just Hatha and Raja. Mantra and Laya Yoga have been dropped altogether, and everybody practices Hatha Yoga to achieve Raja Yoga. And there's sort of no bypassing the Hatha Hatha practice.
So what happened then? What happened to Raja Yoga? It seems like we've been left a bit high and dry. I mean, I know you're probably less of a scholar on modern stuff, aren't you? I guess. But how did it unfold after the Pradipika to gradually get to this state where we don't hear of Raja so much now? I suppose.
That's interesting. I mean, I think because this is going in very much into the modern history, and I think with the revival of asanas in the early 20th century by Swami Shivananda, Krishnamacharya, and others, the emphasis was very much on the physical practice and establishing a collection or a repertoire of postures and how those postures might relate to, say, pranayama and the bandhas and so forth. But not so much meditation. That's the interesting thing. Whereas, of course, in the medieval period, they were very much connected to Raja Yoga. I do think perhaps around the 18th and 19th century, the idea of Raja Yoga itself starts to become very broad, because the term can basically mean the best yoga, the king yoga. The
kingly yoga,
king of all yogas. So you can have dozens of yogas out there, and they might all have their particular names and specific techniques, but the yoga that's supposed to sit on top of them, that's the king of all of them, is Raja Yoga. So when you get lists or collections of yogas, it's usually Raja Yoga is the best of or the goal of all the other yogas. So what tends to happen in the 18th, 19th century is that whoever's teaching yoga decides that they'll use the name Raja Yoga because they believe it's the best yoga, even if it doesn't really involve samadhi very much. So we have some Raja Yoga texts written in the 18th century that are more to do with visualization and mantra practice, and there's very little about samadhi, but they nonetheless call their yoga Raja Yoga. We sort of see the way the term gets used for Patanjali Yoga. Vivekananda and some of the theosophists at the end of the 19th century decide that Patanjali's yoga is the best yoga, which for them it was. That was their sincere belief, I'm sure. And so they start to call it Raja Yoga because they know the connotations of the term Raja Yoga. It's what you call the best yoga. So if you're...
Yes, it's just a sales pitch.
That's right. If you're going to go out there and teach your yoga and you believe it's the most effective, powerful yoga out there, you can call it Raja Yoga and justify it in lots of different ways. So that's pretty much what Vivekananda did, and it took off. It became a very popular idea in India, and that's where also the idea that Raja Yoga, going back to the early Hatha and Raja Yoga texts, is connected with samadhi, and of course Patanjali's yoga is all about the attainment of samadhi, the practice of samadhi. That's why I think it worked very well, that association between Raja Yoga and Patanjali Yoga within India, because everybody realised probably that there was a long association between samadhi and Raja Yoga, and of course Patanjali's yoga became popular in the 20th century. It became a sort of one of the scriptural authorities on yoga that Vivekananda and others used, Krishnamacharya and so forth. And so everyone accepted, yes, that's Raja Yoga. It's a text on samadhi, and then that got transmitted to the West, got transmitted outside.
Just as an adjunct, are there other texts that are of equal quality and kind of clarity as the Patanjali Yoga Shastra or Yoga Sutras around, or is it just that this one text is the text to look at, and we're looking at a broad kind of scope of yoga practices?
Yeah, well, I think that's the key, broad scope of yoga practices. I think that's why it's been a very useful text in the 20th century for various gurus to transmit their teachings, because it covers all the bases, if you like. It has this Ashtanga system. A lot of them wanted to teach yama and niyama, so that's there in a very basic way. And, they have 5 yamas, 5 niyamas, and they can teach that, and it also has a strong emphasis on the mind and the obstacles and how you can practice. You've got this kriya system or this ashtanga system that you can structure a yoga practice around, and I think that's why it's proven to be a very useful conduit, if you like, for gurus in the 19th and early 20th century to sort of say, this is what yoga is. This is everything that you need to know about yoga. It's a sort of it's a framework, a very well-designed framework that people can sort of use to hang their ideas and teachings of yoga.
I suppose what I'm learning here is everyone has their kind of objectives with it, right? And it can be slanted different ways. It's not just like, okay, I've got the Pradipika or I've got the Sutras, kind of like job done, right? Like it's like, well, you know, well, what version have you got, and what commentary have you got, and you know, I mean, there's kind of a lot more to it. I mean, to that end, I was just going to ask you, more practically speaking, if people often say, well, I want to read a text that's going to give me the classical, kind of more classical iterations of what yoga is, like, you know, do we find that in what can we draw from the Svatmarama's Pradipika in terms of kind of information for an asana practitioner? Is there anything that struck you as particularly relevant for you know, the everyday practitioner?
Yeah, I think there are, but it's not apparent, as we were saying just before the podcast. It's a text that I think a lot of beginners pick up and they're disappointed by reading a translation of it. They sort of think,
going to say that.
You know, what was that all about, or what was important about that? A lot of it's cryptic, you know, and it's using you know, terminology about Raja Yoga or Kundalini and so forth, which doesn't necessarily resonate with the modern practitioner, who, of course, has a more scientific notion of the body, anatomy, physiology. So when you read the asanas, there's absolutely, or very, very basic anatomical information, just basically where the legs and the arms might be placed, but there's no particular insight from that perspective, nothing about the physiology, the nervous system. It's also a text, unlike the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, it's also a text it's very much like a practice manual. It doesn't have much to do with, say, psychological insight into the practice, whereas I think people get more from the Yoga Sutras, particularly if the Yoga Sutras has been translated and explained by a guru, a modern practitioner, because they can take all of their own experience, particularly in the asanas or the meditation, and use the sutras, these very pithy statements, to sort of to prompt. They're sort of like, the sutras become like headings for their own explanation of yoga and the experiences that they've had from it. Whereas the Haṭhapradīpikā doesn't really even do that. The verses are not so pithy. You know, they're relatively terse, but they're not general enough to provide to act as hooks for a guru to necessarily expound upon a subject. Yes, and perhaps that's why even though the Haṭhapradīpikā has been translated dozens of times and there are many printed editions of it, and it's usually referred to as the text on Hatha, I don't think it's played as significant a role in the 20th century as the Yoga Sutras, because it's not as accessible, and it doesn't sort of help gurus necessarily to talk about what they want to talk about, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, it's not a hook. What I mean, for example, why do you know why he picked those certain postures in the first place?
The 15
in the Pradipika.
Well, see, this is why I think the text is very. I mean, for me, the Haṭhapradīpikā is well, if you were to ask which yoga text I'd take onto a deserted island.
I should have asked that. Yeah.
It would be.
That's a good question. I'll ask that. Yeah,
the Haṭhapradīpikā. It would be. I mean,
really?
I think the Haṭhapradīpikā is a fantastic creation. It's just so clever on many different levels.
Right.
Basically, we can start to appreciate that when we look at the literature that was written before it and the types of yoga systems that were in place, and how Svatmarama took those, sort of brought the best features of many of them together to create a very sort of a very broad but cohesive structure of Hatha and Raja Yoga, and his work was a success. I mean, it really set the scene for what Hatha and Raja was for the next 300-400 years. And usually in the compendiums and texts that we have that were composed after the Haṭhapradīpikā, it's the format of the Haṭhapradīpikā that's the starting point for them. They might add more material and redefine a few things, but it's generally the general structure of the Haṭhapradīpikā is in place. So the insights that I see around asana in the first chapter, firstly, the verses on diet are attached to the to the section on asana. So I think that's basically saying that diet, food, is very important for the practice of posture, as it is nonetheless also for the practice of pranayama and mudra and Raja Yoga. Although it's interesting that the general medieval position was that in the beginning food is very important, but then once your practice is established, it's not so important. That's also said. With the asanas, of course, he's giving us, I think, just what were considered to be the most important postures, not necessarily any intermediary postures or beginning postures or any variations. He's just sort of giving us what he thought were 15 very important postures. 8 of them are seated postures that you would use for pranayama or mudras, such as Khechari mudra. And the others are these more complex asanas. There's no mention, though, of sequencing. So often it's what's not mentioned that's also interesting. There's no mention of sequencing. There's no mention of how long the postures are held for. There's no mention of the breath, like whether you go into a posture with exhaling and then come out of the posture, inhaling or anything like that. And I think the reason for that is that there was probably no consensus around those issues, and gurus really needed the freedom to be able to teach different strategies, perhaps to different students. That, in other words, it was very difficult to generalize on those issues. So what we often see in yoga texts are the bare bones of a system, the sort of the necessary components, the elements that no one can really disagree with, and then there's usually a lot of ambiguity around that, where they might say, you've got to go off and learn that from the guru, as we see, for instance, with Viparita Karani in the Haṭhapradīpikā. It says this should be learnt from the oral teachings of a guru, and that suggests to me that there was a lot of variation in what was being taught, in the way gurus were teaching it. And the text didn't want to get in the way of that too much, otherwise it wouldn't be useful to people. And if the text, these are texts that are either memorized or written by hand on either on paper or palm leaf. You want your text to be useful when so much effort has gone into creating it and trying to disseminate it by getting people to memorize it and so forth. What we do start to see after the Haṭhapradīpikā are more encyclopedic texts being written that add a lot more information. So we can start to fill in some of those gaps when we read a corpus instead of just one text. And that, to me, perhaps because I've been able to do that both with the early texts and the more recent ones, again brings the Haṭhapradīpikā alive, because I can sort of see some of the things that have been excluded, but I can sort of also see the importance of what has been included and how he sort of created such a clean framework and structure and included the most essential teachings. The texts that tend to add more material tend to be more scholarly works that are written for a more learned audience. So the Haṭhapradīpikā was for a wide audience that probably wasn't necessarily consisting of people with very good Sanskrit who could, say, read the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, which is actually quite a quite a scholarly work. It's written more for someone who had a basic type of Sanskrit, and could sort of get by reading simple verses.
So its aim is much more lay practitioner than Patanjali's text, which is clearly much for more monastic practitioners who've kind of decided to abandon the world, really, right, and devote themselves to celibacy and possessionless. And
well, I would say more learned practitioners, because educated Brahmins could read the Patanjali Yoga Shastra if they would have very good basic Brahmanical training, which was for Brahmin householders. Was they grew up learning the Vedas and Sanskrit, Panini, and the great works of Sanskrit. So they could pick up, I'm sure, the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, and with the help from a guru who knew the technical language and so forth, they'd be able to read it. But of course, with the Haṭhapradīpikā, I think it was going beyond that audience, beyond people who who didn't necessarily have that Brahmanical learning, but nonetheless knew some Sanskrit.
What about the Shatkarmas? Do we find that precedent in previous times, or are they introduced there and then? And people often ask how important whether the Shatkarmas have always come with yoga, or whether because just to kind of try and cover all bases briefly with you, you also done a lot of scholarly work on Ayurvedic texts, right? I mean, there's a principal Ayurvedic text that I always bloody forget the name of. That I read something that you've done on I can't remember what it's called now. Put me out of my misery, but
yoga and medicine.
Foremost
Yoga and medicine.
Yes.
One, yeah.
So, do we start to see the Shatkarmas developed in this kind of area, or are there in the Yoga Bija or other texts you mentioned?
So the earliest instance we have of the Shatkarmas is the Haṭhapradīpikā. Now, the fact that the Haṭhapradīpikā is an anthology opens the possibility that it was borrowed from an earlier text that we no longer have a record of, that no longer survives. That possibility is there. Though it's also possible that Svatmarama introduced them. He knew about these techniques. They were being practiced by some. He thought they were very valuable, and so he decided to make it a sort of a significant feature of Hatha Yoga. And he could have been the first person to do that. We don't know. We know that some of the techniques that he used were coming from other types of yoga that were not Hatha Yoga, and he sort of brought them in to Hatha, and then after that they're considered to be Hatha Yoga. So that could have been part of the case with the Shatkarma. The question I ask in my article on yoga and medicine is whether they're inspired by Ayurvedic techniques, because Ayurveda uses enemas, oil massage, a lot of similar sort of techniques, but I come to the conclusion that there's no real connection between the two, basically because the Shatkarma seem to be conceived for yoga practitioners, whereas with Ayurveda the techniques, the medicines and the therapies that are used are really for a doctor to apply to a patient. So with the Shatkarma, these are things that a yogi learns and then he applies to himself, him or herself.
Yeah.
So there's no real doctor-patient relationship with the Shatkarma. And actually, they require a lot of body control. So the type of dhauti that's taught in the Haṭhapradīpikā requires that the yogi be able to move apana up into the throat so that it can move the cloth out without gagging and so forth. It requires a lot of body control, which of course would require training. So I don't think that's practical in a medical context. You can't sort of have a patient who's unwell come into the into the surgery, and then you say, right, I'm going to start teaching you these yoga techniques, and in 6 months' time they'll actually be really effective. Usually, in Ayurveda, you see medicines, herbs, treatments that can be applied there and then on the patient, and they have a healing effect. So that's one of the main differences between the two. And there's also a lot of details that are different, such as bhasti is usually always done with water. Again, it requires a lot of body control. The yogi is supposed to eventually have a sort of a conscious control over the sphincter muscles to allow the water to come in and out. You also need to create an inner vacuum to suck the water up into the body. And of course, the enema that's used in Ayurveda is done usually with an implement, and it usually always involves some type of medication in the water or in an oil. It's not just a plain water type of enema in Ayurveda, from what I've gathered. So there's details that, to me, are significant enough to suggest that the Shatkarma were probably developed by yogis for yoga practitioners. And even though there were general notions of medicine floating around, and you see this in Tantra and Brahmanical texts and so forth, they had basic notions of disease. We see those in yoga texts, but it doesn't have the detail and the sort of complex theory behind it that we see in Ayurvedic traditions. So again, that to me suggests that yogis were probably more inspired by healing techniques that yoga practitioners had developed, rather than going off to Vaidyas to sort of develop healing techniques.
Yeah. Certainly if you read like the Shatkarmas in Theos Bernard or something like that, you kind of think, well, this is not something a sick person would be, or any person exactly could be, would find easy to do, right? I mean, they're very involved. And I mean, I was thinking though that you do mention Ashtanga coming from, there's a mention of Ashtanga in the Ayurveda terminology, right? That this idea of Ashtanga wasn't formulated by Patanjali. So there must be some kind of interrelation or interpolation between old Ayurvedic texts and this gradual, weaving into, say, where we get to Swatmarama.
I think there is a relationship between the two, undoubtedly, and there would have been Vaidyas that had a knowledge of yoga and yogis that had some knowledge of Ayurveda. But I think what we can state is that the proponents of those traditions, when it came to writing the Shastra and deciding what was really fundamental to their traditions of knowledge, didn't consider, in the case of Ayurveda, that yoga was particularly fundamental, and in the case of yoga, they didn't consider Ayurveda to be fundamental. That basically, in yoga, it's the practice of yoga, and I would say the fundamental thing is really samadhi, the attaining of samadhi for the achievement of liberation. And in Ayurveda, it was techniques, it was medicines, herbs in particular, and therapeutic techniques that a doctor could apply to a patient. That to me seems to be fundamental. And we do get some references. So in the Charaka Samhita, there's a chapter on yoga. It's a very sort of old form of yoga that predates Patanjali, and it has this 8 auxiliaries, and that's
what I was talking about.
It's a very Buddhist type of yoga. So but nonetheless, when you read that's a huge text, the Charaka Samhita. When you read the aims of the practice and the general overview, yoga doesn't really figure to any great extent outside that chapter. Yes, but nonetheless they were aware. They certainly didn't exist in airtight chambers. Yes, I would say the relationship today, though, seems to be a lot closer. The fact
more cohesive. Absolutely, yoga's used as therapy so much.
Yeah, in the 20th century, and in the on the Ayurvedic side, the degree or the sort of system of learning in India integrates yoga for doctors. They basically have to spend, I think, at least 6 months learning about yoga techniques. So if you go to any Vaidya, any Ayurvedic doctor in India today, he'll know some asanas and the basics of yoga, and that's because the national curriculum integrates yoga.
Finally, I wanted to ask him, in all this talk about identifying the authentic text, the original kind of reference points of, say, a Swatmarama or Patanjali, and how important is the individual in this? Because as you mentioned yourself, I mean, there's people that wrote stuff in the margins, there's people saying this or that, and that stuff might be relevant. So do we need the persons, what they said about it? How, do you see what I mean? Like, how important is it to know exactly what Swatmarama says, as opposed to the evolution 50 years later when someone came up with some, let's add that, or, Do you see what I mean? Like, right? Like,
Yeah.
Like if it's always been in evolution, where's the line in the sand when you go, this guy's a genius, and I'm going to look at, I'm going to follow his stuff because I kind of trust Svatmarama, whereas I don't trust this guy over here who penciled a few notes while having a little coffee somewhere.
Yeah.
But he might have been really good.
Yeah. Well, I think in order to make that decision, you need to know both. So,
Right.
part of our quest is to sort of try and figure out what Svatmarama might have been thinking, because a lot of it's been lost, to be honest, with the different versions of the text floating around and the fact that we can't sort of call him up on the phone and ask him questions directly. A lot of that early formation of the text, we're just trying to piece together with various clues and inferences based on the current material, and then to sort of see the different versions of the text, how it changed. I think that really just provides people with more choices, is that they can sort of see how things were added, how things may have been omitted, and then they if they're dealing with the text, they can sort of make decisions about whether that was important or not, whether that's something that they need to take into account. As I say, when you're just dealing with a text that's printed and you think that's the text, it's a fixed thing, then you really can't see beyond it. You can't or can't see through it or underneath it. And that's also another good reason for being aware of the other yoga texts that were written, the texts that Svatmarama used, because in some cases they were saying something very different to what he said. In the case of the text I did for my doctoral research, the Amanaska, that text is saying that Hatha Yoga is not necessary. It's a waste of time, it's unnecessary exertion. It just, pranayama brings about a lot of pain and suffering. Forget about it. Just practice Shambhavi Mudra. You can achieve Raja Yoga that way, and job's done. So that's interesting, and you sort of see the way teachings are reinterpreted. For instance, this idea that the mind and the breath are interdependent, that if one is active, the other is active. If one stops, the other stops. Well, that in the Amanaska is used as a reason for not needing to practice pranayama, because if you can stop the mind through a technique such as Shambhavi Mudra, then the breath will automatically stop. So you don't need to do any deliberate retentions. Svatmarama takes those verses on the interdependence of the mind and breath and formulates the very opposite argument. It says, well, if the mind and the breath are interconnected, then focus on doing deliberate retentions to stop the breath, and then the mind will stop. And this is, of course, the justification for the practice of pranayama. You can sort of start to see these debates that have been happening over the centuries by reading a broader corpus. And, of course, we see these debates happening today. You'll see systems of Raja Yoga in India today that are focused just on meditation. You don't need to do any complex asanas. And you'll see, such as in Vivekananda's book, Raja Yoga, he'll say, this Hatha Yoga is just physical exertion, it's just about the body. Yeah. So these debates have been going on for a long time. When you look through the history, you can start to see them and start to get a better idea at what was at stake, why particular traditions are arguing a particular position. And that, I think, helps people to navigate the great number of yogas that are available today, the different traditions that are teaching it, and the way it's being reinterpreted worldwide in so many different ways.
Well, I mean, lastly, what advice would you give then for some? Because you're talking about a lot of intertextual comparison. I mean, what do you do if you haven't got the scholarly background to get a little bit of a context?
Well, I'm hoping that our publications will help people,
right.
and also just talking to you and writing articles, also teaching on trainings. We're all fairly active trying to sort of teach the history of yoga on that level, to sort of, because there's 2,000 years of yoga's history. That brings a tremendous richness to the tradition that's often not the case with other disciplines like necessarily Pilates and other traditions. And I think that makes yoga a richer experience for many people. It can cause confusion in some cases because there's multiple yogas and multiple interpretations. But often an education in the history and theory of yoga helps people to navigate those challenges, which are there anyway, because anyone who goes to India today can learn very different types of yoga and will hear contradictory statements about yoga, about what it can do and what it can achieve. So an idea of the history can help people understand the contradictions and
to navigate
diversity.
their own methods and then their aims as well. You know. Well, it's been a wonderful chat, Jason. Thanks for your time, and I really appreciate it. How can people find the project? I suppose it's you've got a website for it.
Not yet, but there will be one soon.
No, not yet. Okay, right. Coming up. Watch out. We'll put any notes in the footnotes here. All right. Okay. Well, thanks, Jason, for your time.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks.
you.
Thanks
Wonderful
very
chat.
much.
Thank you.